and a reasonable amount of goodwill will do quite nicely, I think, if the shriller voices, the ideologically driven voices, can be made déclassé, not repressed, just simply recognized as tasteless. Anything else? Yes.
Could you reflect on what culture will be like after the end of time, and what the end of time has to do with what you said tonight? What kind of time? Yeah, the different kinds of time, or?
Well, yeah, I've reflected on what it's like. It's sort of a blank screen on which to project your mind. What will it be like once we pass the omega point? I'm not really sure. I mean, you can take two approaches to it. You can take the sort of the Deus ex machina approach, which means we can't know what it is. It's going to be so wonderful. It's going to be like the descent of the flying saucers, and we will all march into the four-gated city, and that will be it. Or you can take a more conservative approach and say, well, maybe there's something going on in the trends around us that we can extrapolate to try and understand the world beyond the end of time. Taking that approach, what I think is happening, and it's been happening for a long time, and it's very interesting, is that culture is another dimension that and perhaps properly so. In the early part of my talk, I talked about how culture had subsumed the position of nature, so that we had lost sight of nature by erecting culture through erecting these linguistic structures. But I noticed that, and not only linguistic structures, but architectural structures, the infrastructure of our society, that is what culture is. The way we differ from the Witoto is all the stuff that we have bound into ideas and excreted through our engineering processes to surround ourselves with. This dimension, which is culture, is becoming ever more all-inclusive, at the same time that it's also becoming, strangely enough, ever more ethereal, ever less material. A perfect example of this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but if you deal with the Macintosh computer, the operating system of the Mac is the genius of it, and what makes it the best in the biz is that it attempts to trick you into believing that you're dealing with ordinary three-dimensional space. You know, you don't type in commands, you don't choose printed options, you move in a symbolic representation of three-dimensional space. Well, again, to mention William Gibson and his novels, what he imagines is simply a larger version of this conventionalized symbolic representation of three-dimensional space, so that you enter, in his novels, his characters enter into a world where the Bank of America database is perceived as a huge red rectangle, hundreds of feet in height, in a certain spot in the memory of this global computer. And yes, it's cyberspace. And near it is the memory bank of Wells Fargo or something else. So that when you enter into cyberspace, ordinary reality is replaced by a symbolic representation of the informational content of ordinary reality. Well, this is in fact happening. It's happening at a very rapid rate. So the dimension which we call culture, which we have previously erected in the three-dimensional world around us through the intercession of what we call manufacturing and architecture, is very rapidly being internalized and erected as cyberspace, this alternative dimension to ordinary three-dimensional space, in which our minds are able to move like fish in water. What I think lies beyond the end of time is a very concrete realization of this other dimension. That's why things like the time wave that I've developed and some of these other projections run off the scale. The world beyond the end of history is literally not mappable in the lower order set of mapping that are applicable to history. So it is like being downloaded into circuitry. It's possible to conceive of the entire human species fitting into the area of a large refrigerator in cyberspace, so that the goal of history is the creation of a mirror image of culture in the cyberspatial dimension, so that culture in the dimension of nature can be slowly retracted into the compressed quintessence. You can almost think of this as an alchemical process. We're talking about forging a philosopher's stone out of a hyperdimensional medium which is composed of energy and language, and into which we can all cast ourselves at will. It is, Plato said, if God didn't exist, man would invent him, her, it. Well, it may well be that the pilot's seat, the pilot's chair of the flying saucer is empty. It awaits mankind. It is the condensed expectation of complete interpenetration of all of us through each other and our cultural artifacts in a mode that we cannot even imagine. At an earlier talk at Will's here a couple of years ago, I did a talk called Shedding the Monkeys, in which I talked about dropping the primate image that is projected onto the human soul through the accidents of biological evolution. That as we take control of our genetic heritage, as we take control of the process of manufacturing culture, we are going to become what we dream we are. And we have never really explored consciously what it is we dream we are. But very shortly, this will become a major part of the cultural agenda, because we are going to be able to do anything. And with that kind of power, again recurring to the theme of the evening, I think we have to anchor ourselves in nature. So sort of my apotheosis, or my vision of how this should come to be, is that everyone is given their own 500 acres of paradise in the chip. And that is your heritage, your space, your right place to be. And out of the mellowness which accrues only to the very wealthy, which we will then, each and every one of us, fall into that category, we will be able to return to the dimension of the limited pie and very decorously and thoughtfully portion it out in a sane and rational manner. And it's very, very tricky, see, this rush toward the ability to completely realize the self-image in hyperspace. My mother used to say to me when I was a small child,